Lucas had always been a dreamer, someone who saw the stars and wondered what lay beyond the shimmering lights in the night sky. He never imagined that one day he would be chosen for something as extraordinary as the intergalactic exchange program. Yet, here he was, standing in the heart of Aoria, an alien world so different from anything he had ever known. Aoria was a planet unlike any other. Its cities floated above the ground, glowing with an ethereal light that seemed to pulse with life. The inhabitants, the Aorans, were an advanced species who had evolved far beyond the physical limitations of humans. But what set them apart from any other race in the galaxy was their unique ability to sense emotions. It was as though every feeling, every thought, was visible to everyone around them. To Lucas, this was both fascinating and terrifying. When Lucas first stepped onto Aoria, the air felt different, more electric, like the planet itself was alive and watching him. He could feel the weight of the atmosphere pressing down on him, not because it was physically oppressive, but because everything around him seemed to be aware of his every move. As he walked through the bustling streets of the city, he noticed the way the Aorans looked at him, never just with curiosity, but with understanding, as if they could see straight through him. It was as if his thoughts and feelings were open for all to see, and it made him feel incredibly vulnerable. The hardest part for Lucas was not just the alien environment, but the overwhelming sensation that he could no longer hide anything. On Earth, he could keep his emotions in check, put on a mask when necessary, but here, it was impossible. Every moment felt like he was being exposed, like his deepest fears and desires were being laid bare. The Aorans, with their ability to sense emotions, could tell exactly how he was feeling, no matter how hard he tried to conceal it. The thought of being constantly read by everyone made him feel as though he was no longer himself. At first, Lucas thought this ability of the Aorans was a blessing, an ability to connect on a deeper level. But as the days went on, he realized how unsettling it could be. The slightest shift in his mood was immediately noticed. If he felt nervous or anxious, it was mirrored in the eyes of those around him. There were no walls, no barriers to keep his true feelings from being known. It was like walking around in a world where his emotions were no longer private, and the idea of vulnerability was suddenly thrust into his face. The overwhelming nature of Aoria was compounded by the fact that Lucas was also struggling with the need to fit in. He wasn't just dealing with a new culture. He was dealing with a society that thrived on emotional transparency. For someone like him, who had always been guarded and cautious about showing his true feelings, this was a massive challenge. The first few days were the hardest. He wandered through the streets of Aoria, feeling the eyes of the Aorans on him at all times. Everywhere he went, people seemed to know exactly what he was thinking, or at least they acted like they did. Lucas had never been one to share his emotions openly, and now he felt like an open book, his thoughts and feelings on display for everyone to see. Even the simplest interactions with the locals left him feeling exposed. It wasn't until he met Lyra, the Aoran who would be his roommate for the duration of his stay, that things began to shift. Lyra was unlike anyone he had ever met. She was kind, patient, and above all, understanding. From the moment they met, she seemed to sense the unease that radiated from Lucas. She didn't push him to open up, but instead simply gave him space and time to adjust. She understood the discomfort he felt in a world where emotions were so openly shared, and instead of making him feel ashamed of his struggles, she made him feel heard. Lyra was an Aoran, and like all her people, she could feel Lucas's emotions. However, she never made him feel as though his vulnerability was a weakness. On the contrary, she seemed to understand that his reluctance to expose his emotions came from a place of fear, not arrogance. And so, she offered him something that no one else could, the assurance that it was okay to take things slow, to open up in his own time. Yet, despite her kindness, Lucas still struggled with the idea of being constantly read. Every time he spoke to Lyra, he could feel her perceptiveness, the way she seemed to know exactly what he was thinking before he even said it. It was as if she was reading him like an open book. Though she was gentle with him, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that nothing was truly private here. The very thing that made the Aorans so unique, their ability to sense emotions, was the same thing that made him feel like a stranger in his own skin. Adrian, his best friend back on Earth, was the one person Lucas turned to when the weight of everything became too much to bear. Adrian had always been his anchor, the one person who understood him without judgment. He had been there for Lucas through every challenge, big and small. Now, as Lucas found himself isolated on an alien world, Adrian was the one person he could still rely on. During one of their long video calls, Lucas poured his heart out, telling Adrian how alienating it was to live in a world where his emotions were constantly exposed. He confessed that he felt like he was losing himself in the process, unable to hold on to the privacy and solitude he had once valued so much. Adrian listened carefully, offering words of encouragement, reminding Lucas that this was just a phase and that things would get better with time. "Remember why you're there, Lucas," Adrian said. "You're part of something bigger now. You'll find your way." That conversation helped Lucas find some clarity. He realized that despite the discomfort, this was an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to understand himself on a deeper level. He didn't have to hide his feelings forever, but maybe, just maybe, he could learn to be more open, to trust others, and to accept that vulnerability didn't make him weak, it made him human. And then there was Lyra. Despite all his unease, she remained a constant source of support. Over time, their relationship grew from being mere roommates to something more. She had this way of making him feel like he wasn't just another stranger on her world, but someone worthy of understanding. Her patience with him was unwavering, and for the first time since arriving on Aoria, Lucas felt a glimmer of hope. As the days passed, Lucas found himself starting to relax around Lyra. He began to understand that in Aoria, vulnerability wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. But even as he began to open up more, he still had one question that lingered in the back of his mind. Could he ever truly accept this new way of life? Would he ever be able to shed the layers of self-protection that had defined him for so long? The journey was far from over, but with Lyra's understanding and Adrian's encouragement, Lucas began to see that this exchange, this immersion into Aoria's culture, wasn't just about learning to fit in. It was about learning to be himself in a world that could feel as alien as the stars themselves. And so, as Lucas continued to navigate this strange, beautiful planet, he knew one thing for certain. The journey had only just begun. Life with Lyra was an emotional labyrinth for Lucas. It was not just the strange, alien world around him, or the unfamiliar landscape that made him uneasy. It was the constant feeling that his every emotion was laid bare. The moment he crossed the threshold of their shared room, he could feel the weight of her presence, and it unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Lyra was not just his roommate. She was an embodiment of everything he was struggling with, the raw, unguarded openness of Aoria. Every time he met her gaze, he felt like she was reading him, not just in the way that people on Earth might interpret body language or facial expressions, but in a far more profound, almost invasive way. There was no hiding his emotions on Aoria, especially not from Lyra. She could feel everything, his anxiety, his confusion, the unease that followed him around like a shadow. And Lucas hated it. He hated that there was no barrier between his inner world and the one that Lyra inhabited, no shield that allowed him to preserve even a sliver of privacy. Lyra, however, never pushed him. She never judged him for his vulnerability. She seemed to know that it wasn't easy for him, that the intense sensitivity of Aoria was nothing like what he had experienced on Earth. She was patient with him, perhaps more patient than anyone else had ever been, though she could sense the discomfort in his every move, the slight twitch of his fingers, the way his breath quickened whenever their conversations veered into more personal territory. She did not rush him. She could feel his reluctance, yet she respected it. There was an understanding in her eyes whenever she spoke to him, as if she knew that his journey would not be a quick one. For Lyra, helping Lucas was not just about fulfilling her role as his roommate. There was something deeper in the way she approached their relationship. She wasn't just trying to get him to fit into Aoria's culture. She was genuinely trying to help him find his place, to heal whatever it was that made him so guarded. Every interaction with him, every word she spoke was carefully measured, as though she understood that Lucas needed time to open up. And yet, despite her best efforts, she could feel the walls Lucas had built around himself. She wasn't sure if he even knew how much pain he was carrying, how much he was hiding from not just her, but from himself. From her perspective, it wasn't just about the external discomfort of living in a foreign world. It was the emotional weight she felt coming from Lucas, the depth of his inner conflict. As she watched him struggle to adapt to Aoria, she couldn't help but wonder what had made him so closed off. What had happened in his past to make him so wary of being seen for who he truly was? Lyra couldn't ask him, not yet. But she felt the silent invitation in his eyes, a subtle plea for understanding, though he didn't know how to ask for it. The difficulty Lucas faced in trying to hide his emotions didn't only stem from his interactions with Lyra. It was the same everywhere he went on Aoria. He realized with increasing discomfort that it wasn't just Lyra who could read him. It was everyone. The people of Aoria, with their innate ability to sense emotions, made it impossible for Lucas to maintain the illusion of control he had grown accustomed to on Earth. In every conversation, in every shared glance, he felt exposed. The people here didn't just see his face or his body language. They could feel the vibrations of his soul, the raw currents of his thoughts. He couldn't hide his fear, his confusion, or his sadness. It was exhausting. And yet, despite all of this, there was something about Lyra that he couldn't shake. As much as he wanted to retreat, to withdraw into the shell he had spent so many years building, Lyra had this quiet way of drawing him out. It wasn't through force or pressure. It was through simple, gentle understanding. She didn't try to fix him, didn't try to change him. Instead, she simply offered her presence, a steadying force that helped him face the emotional chaos swirling inside of him. As the days passed, Lucas found himself becoming more aware of her subtle kindness. The way she would pause before speaking, as if she was giving him time to process. The way she would listen without judgment, even when he didn't say a word. And slowly, a part of him began to soften. He found himself drawn to her in ways that were difficult to understand, his emotions becoming tangled in a web he didn't know how to unravel. It was a slow, tentative connection, but it was real. And it terrified him. Lucas had always prided himself on his ability to control his emotions, to keep his vulnerabilities hidden. But now, with Lyra constantly around, his emotions seemed to take on a life of their own. Every conversation with her seemed to expose a new layer of himself, and though he resisted at first, there was something incredibly freeing about it. For the first time, Lucas was forced to face his own vulnerabilities. And in some strange way, he found comfort in Lyra's unwavering patience. But that didn't make it easier. The more he allowed himself to relax around Lyra, the more he realized how much he had been hiding, even from himself. There were things buried deep within him, things he hadn't allowed himself to confront for years. And as Lyra continued to help him navigate his feelings, Lucas began to realize that perhaps the true challenge of his journey wasn't adapting to Aoria's strange culture. It was confronting the emotional walls he had built around his own heart. Though their relationship was still firmly rooted in friendship, something deeper was starting to take shape. There was a tenderness in the way Lyra looked at him, a silent understanding that spoke volumes. Lucas, despite his resistance, couldn't help but feel it. And as the days stretched into weeks, he began to see that perhaps his time on Aoria wasn't just about learning to live in a new world. It was about learning to trust again, learning to be open, and most importantly, learning that it was okay to let someone else see the parts of him that he had kept hidden for so long. But that realization was far from easy. The closer he got to Lyra, the more his insecurities bubbled to the surface. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying. And as much as Lyra's presence offered him comfort, it also reminded him of just how much he had to lose. Lucas began to feel increasingly isolated in a world that was meant to be a place of connection. The realization that not only Lyra but every Aoran around him could sense his emotions started to weigh heavily on him. He had always prided himself on maintaining a certain level of control over his inner world. On Earth, he could keep his feelings hidden behind carefully constructed walls, but on Aoria, those walls seemed meaningless. Every passing moment felt like he was being scrutinized, his every emotion laid bare for the world to see. People around him didn't just see his facial expressions or body language. They could feel the turmoil inside him, the doubts, the confusion, and the growing sense of fear that had taken root ever since his arrival. It was as if there was no longer a private space for him, no escape from the overwhelming exposure. The hardest part for Lucas wasn't just the lack of privacy, it was the constant pressure of being understood. He found himself unable to hide his inner thoughts, which made simple interactions more complicated than they had ever been before. On Earth, when he interacted with others, he could always retreat into his mental shell, distancing himself from his true feelings. But here, there was no such thing as distance. Every time he spoke, it felt as though the person on the other end could read between the lines and see what he truly thought, even when he didn't say it aloud. At first, Lucas tried to maintain some sense of control, but it was futile. Whether he was trying to hide his nervousness or calm his doubts, it didn't matter. The Aorans could feel it, and Lucas could feel their awareness, which only intensified his anxiety. This constant state of vulnerability began to take its toll. Lucas found it increasingly difficult to maintain the distance he had always relied on in his relationships. He wanted to communicate, but he couldn't do it in the way he was used to. Words, for him, had always been a way to shield his true emotions, to project an image that wasn't quite as raw as what he was feeling. But here, on Aoria, his emotions had a life of their own. They were no longer something he could control or hide. They were exposed for all to see, even when he wasn't ready to face them himself. This struggle to communicate left Lucas feeling more and more distant from those around him. He tried to be open, to engage with the people in the community, but every interaction left him feeling more alienated. He couldn't seem to bridge the gap between the person he was becoming and the person he once was, the person who could hide behind words and pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. There were moments when he felt like he was losing touch with himself, unable to even express what he was feeling, because the act of expression itself was so overwhelming. Every word seemed like it would expose him even further, and yet silence felt like a betrayal. It was a constant struggle to find the balance between wanting to connect and fearing the vulnerability that connection required. The one person Lucas found solace in was Jolan, his teacher at Aoria. Jolan was the only person who could talk to him without needing to feel everything that Lucas was going through. Their conversations were a refuge for Lucas, a space where he could express his fears without being judged. Jolan had been a guide to many like Lucas, people from different planets who came to Aoria seeking to understand its ways. He had seen the struggles of many, but what made Jolan particularly valuable to Lucas was his ability to give advice without overwhelming him with emotions of his own. Jolan's calm, steady demeanor allowed Lucas to feel like he could finally say what had been bottled up for so long. In their talks, Jolan would often remind Lucas that the overwhelming openness of Aoria wasn't meant to be a burden. It was supposed to be a gift. He explained that in the Aoran culture, emotional transparency was seen as a strength, a way to build trust and deepen relationships. But Lucas wasn't ready to accept this idea. It felt unnatural to him, as though his emotions were no longer his own to control. And yet, Jolan's words kept ringing in his ears. Perhaps it wasn't about avoiding vulnerability. It was about embracing it. He would have to face his fears and allow himself to feel, to truly understand his emotions, rather than running from them. Despite Jolan's advice, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that he was still caught in a world that didn't quite belong to him. Every day, he felt the distance between himself and the world around him growing. He wasn't sure where he fit in anymore, or if he even could fit in. He was surrounded by people who could sense his every doubt, every hidden fear, and it made him feel like a ghost in his own life. In some ways, it felt like the more he learned about Aoria, the more he became a stranger to himself. The very culture that was meant to bring people together seemed to alienate him even further. He found himself questioning whether it was possible to find freedom in a place where nothing was private, where every part of himself was constantly on display. Lucas couldn't deny the truth of his emotions anymore. He had spent so long hiding behind walls, thinking that if he just kept them up, he could maintain some semblance of control. But Aoria had stripped him of that illusion. Now there was no choice but to confront the reality of his feelings. and it terrified him. It wasn't just about living in a new world. It was about learning to accept himself in a way he never had before. But how could he do that when he felt so lost, so disconnected from everything he knew? And yet, in the midst of all this confusion, Lucas realized something important. Perhaps the greatest challenge of his journey wasn't about adapting to the society around him. It was about finding the strength to adapt to his own emotions. He had always been so determined to control everything, to keep his feelings in check. But now, it was time to learn how to embrace them, to accept the rawness of his vulnerability and allow himself the freedom to feel. And maybe, just maybe, that was the key to finding peace, not just on Aoria, but within himself. The relationship between Lucas and Lyra had always been built on the foundation of mutual respect and understanding. But it wasn't until the days turned into weeks that Lucas began to realize just how much their connection had grown. At first, the communication between them had been strained, filled with awkward silences and unspoken barriers. Lucas had always been a guarded person, someone who struggled to let others in, even those who wanted to help him. But as time passed, those walls he had so carefully constructed began to crumble, albeit slowly and with much internal struggle. Lyra, on the other hand, had always been patient, understanding the nature of Lucas's emotional resistance. She never pushed him to open up. Instead, she waited. She had always known that Lucas wasn't the kind of person to wear his heart on his sleeve. Yet, despite his reluctance, there was something in him that yearned for connection, something that drew him closer to her each day. In the beginning, Lyra had noticed the walls Lucas had put up, the hesitation in his eyes when she would ask him questions, the way he would retreat inwardly whenever she got too close. But as they spent more time together, she started to see beyond that resistance. She began to understand that it wasn't just fear that kept him distant. It was years of emotional wounds, things he wasn't ready to confront yet. One evening, as they sat quietly in their shared living space, Lyra glanced over at Lucas, noticing how his posture had relaxed over the past few days. He no longer sat rigidly, always on alert. Now he seemed more at ease, his guardedness slipping just a little. "You know," Lyra said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "I can feel it, Lucas. You're starting to trust me." Lucas looked at her, his eyes betraying a flicker of hesitation. "I'm not sure if I trust myself, Lyra," he admitted quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. "But I'm starting to feel like I don't have to hide everything all the time." Lyra's heart softened as she heard those words. She had waited so long for him to open up, even just a little, and now she felt like she was finally beginning to understand him in a way she hadn't before. She knew how much it cost him to say that, how vulnerable it made him feel. "You don't have to hide, Lucas," she replied gently, her voice full of sincerity. "You don't need to be afraid of what you feel. I'm here. I won't judge you." For the first time in weeks, Lucas allowed himself to let his guard down, even if just for a moment. He exhaled deeply, a small but meaningful gesture. He realized that despite his fear, despite the vulnerability that made him want to pull back, there was a comfort in knowing that Lyra wasn't going anywhere. She had been there every step of the way, never demanding more than he was ready to give. Yet even as Lucas began to open up, there was still a part of him that remained hesitant. A part of him that feared what this connection meant, feared how much he was beginning to rely on her. He had never been one to let people in easily, and this new, uncharted territory, was frightening. Lyra, for her part, felt the shift in their relationship as well. It wasn't just about helping Lucas adapt to his new surroundings anymore. There was something deeper between them, something more personal. She could sense it, feel it in the air when they spoke, in the way their conversations lingered just a little longer, in the way their silences were no longer uncomfortable but shared. There was a pull between them that neither of them could deny. But Lyra also recognized that she couldn't rush this. She had to let Lucas come to terms with his emotions in his own time, just as she had come to terms with her own feelings. There were moments when she caught herself staring at him a little too long, when her heart skipped a beat at the way he smiled or the way he trusted her, even just a little. But she didn't say anything. She couldn't. They were still in a delicate place, and rushing things could risk undoing the fragile bond they had built. As their bond deepened, so did the uncertainty between them. Lucas felt a growing sense of connection, but with it came the fear of what it might mean. Could he really allow himself to open up fully to someone else? To someone from a world so different from his own? Could he risk the possibility of losing himself in this strange, beautiful relationship? And Lyra, though she felt a pull toward him, wasn't sure whether this was just a deepening friendship or something more. She was willing to wait, to let him figure it out, but she couldn't deny that a part of her hoped that this connection would turn into something more. As the days passed, the bond between them became undeniable. There were no clear-cut moments, no dramatic confessions, but rather an accumulation of small, meaningful gestures that signified the depth of their growing feelings. And though neither of them was ready to put a label on it yet, one thing was certain. Their relationship had begun to shift. It was no longer just about surviving together in a foreign world. It was about discovering something deeper, something neither of them could have anticipated. Kayla had always been Lyra's closest confidant. As children, they had shared everything, from their hopes and fears to their deepest secrets. So when Lyra started spending more time with Lucas, it didn't take long for Kayla to notice. At first, she had been curious, observing from the sidelines as their interactions grew more frequent. But as she watched their bond deepen, Kayla's skepticism began to grow. She couldn't understand what Lyra saw in him. Lucas was from Earth, a species that had no connection to the Aorans, a race so deeply attuned to emotions that they could feel everything around them. And for all his intelligence and curiosity, Lucas was still so different from the people Kayla knew and loved. Lyra had always been careful with her emotions, even with Kayla. She had always been the more reserved of the two, holding her feelings close and only sharing them with the few people she trusted completely. And yet, now she was opening herself up to Lucas, someone from a completely different world. Kayla found herself questioning why Lyra would risk so much, especially when she had already witnessed how challenging it could be to form connections between different species. The emotional divide between the Aorans and humans seemed like an insurmountable obstacle. Even more concerning to Kayla was the way Lyra seemed to lose herself a little in Lucas's presence, as though she was letting her guard down in ways that Kayla had never seen before. One evening, as they sat in their usual spot by the window, Lyra absent-mindedly gazing out at the twin suns setting over the horizon, Kayla spoke up. "Do you really think it's wise, Lyra?" she asked quietly, trying to keep her voice neutral, but the concern in her eyes was evident. Lyra turned to face her, her eyes soft but resolute. "I don't know what you mean." Kayla sighed, shaking her head. "You're so different when he's around. I've never seen you like this, Lyra. You're letting him in, and it worries me. Can a bond like this even work? A human and an Aoran? The differences between you two are vast." Lyra's expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. She had expected Kayla to say something like this. Kayla was protective of her, and she had always been cautious about the choices Lyra made, especially when it came to matters of the heart. But this was different. "Kayla, I know it seems strange. I can't explain it, but there's something real between us. I can feel it." Kayla's face softened with understanding, but the skepticism still lingered in her eyes. "I just don't want to see you hurt. I've seen what happens when we try to bridge gaps that should never be crossed. We don't know what this will do to you." But Lyra was resolute. She knew that Kayla's fears came from a place of love and care, but something inside her told her that this was something she needed to explore, something she couldn't just dismiss. "I have to try, Kayla. This connection, it feels like something I've never felt before." Kayla looked at her for a long moment, unsure of what to say. She wasn't entirely convinced that Lyra's feelings for Lucas were as strong as she believed, but she couldn't deny that something had shifted. Over the next few days, Kayla watched as Lyra grew more relaxed, more herself when Lucas was around. She saw the subtle changes in Lyra's demeanor, the way her face lit up when Lucas entered the room, the way she would carefully listen to him as if hanging on every word. The change in Lucas was just as obvious. When they first met, he had been withdrawn, constantly battling with his emotions and the alien world around him. But now, as Kayla observed, Lucas was beginning to open up. It was small at first. He was more present in their conversations, less guarded, allowing his true feelings to surface without that constant defensive layer he once held up. Kayla noticed the softness in his eyes when he looked at Lyra, the way he seemed to trust her more with each passing day. Kayla had to admit, there was something genuine between them, something that went beyond just curiosity, or the novelty of their different worlds. Slowly, she began to see what Lyra had felt all along. This wasn't just about crossing boundaries or defying norms. This was about two people, despite all their differences, finding something deep and meaningful in each other. One evening, as the three of them sat together, sharing a quiet dinner under the fading light of the Aorian sky, Kayla realized that perhaps she had misjudged the situation. The way Lyra and Lucas interacted, the way they shared these quiet, intimate moments, wasn't something to be feared. It was something to be embraced. Kayla could see the care they had for each other, the trust that had formed between them. Lucas wasn't just a stranger from another planet anymore. He was someone Lyra had let in, someone who had become part of her life in a way Kayla could never have imagined. Kayla felt a shift in her heart. Her fears began to melt away as she saw the real connection between them. She had been so focused on the potential obstacles, the cultural differences, the emotional risks, that she had missed the most important part of all. The way Lyra and Lucas made each other feel seen, understood, and cherished. "Maybe I was wrong," Kayla said quietly to Lyra one evening, her voice soft, but full of sincerity. "I see it now. I see what you see in him." Lyra smiled, the warmth in her eyes showing just how far their friendship had come. "Thank you, Kayla. It means everything to me that you're starting to understand." From that moment on, Kayla became Lyra's unwavering support, helping her navigate the complexities of her emotions and the new dynamic with Lucas. And in the process, Kayla learned something valuable. That sometimes, it's not about judging the differences, but about embracing the connections that make us all human, no matter where we come from. As the days passed, the connection between Lucas and Lyra deepened in ways neither of them could have predicted. What had started as a tentative friendship, built on mutual respect and the slow exchange of personal experiences, gradually transformed into something more. At first, neither of them had acknowledged it. The idea of moving beyond the boundaries of friendship seemed far too complicated, especially in a world so different from their own. Yet the more time they spent together, the more difficult it became to deny the growing bond between them. Lucas found himself struggling with his emotions. He had always been the type of person to keep his feelings buried, hidden beneath layers of hesitation and fear. But with Lyra, something was different. Every time they talked, shared a quiet moment, or even just looked at each other, Lucas could feel the shift inside him. It wasn't just the ease of their friendship anymore. There was a warmth, a pull between them that made him feel more alive than he ever had before. He couldn't deny it any longer. The admiration, the trust, the sense of comfort they shared. It had transformed into something far deeper. Yet, despite this growing connection, Lucas found himself paralyzed by fear. He was afraid of what admitting these feelings might mean. It wasn't just that Lyra was from a different world, it was the overwhelming realization that they were crossing boundaries he had never been prepared to cross. Love, for him, had always been something complicated and messy, something to keep at arm's length. And now, he was faced with the undeniable truth that the emotions he had been feeling for Lyra were not just friendly affection, they were something more. But acknowledging it meant facing the reality that this feeling could change everything. As Lucas wrestled with his emotions, Lyra too found herself confronting feelings she hadn't fully understood. She had always been a deeply perceptive person, especially when it came to emotions. But with Lucas, things were different. She could feel the way he struggled, the way he pulled away even as he was drawn toward her. Lyra had spent so much time focusing on helping him adapt to this strange new world, never expecting that somewhere along the way she would begin to fall for him. It wasn't just the comfort she found in his company, or the way he made her feel understood. It was something deeper, something that grew stronger with every moment they shared. Lyra noticed the subtle changes in their interactions. The way his eyes softened when they talked about their pasts, the way his hand would brush against hers when they worked side by side. It wasn't just friendship, it was intimacy. She could feel it, and she knew Lucas could feel it too, even if he didn't want to admit it. One evening, as they sat together under the fading light of Aoria's twin suns, Lyra turned to Lucas, her gaze filled with quiet understanding. She knew that the unspoken tension between them couldn't be ignored forever. They had spent so much time together, learning about each other's worlds, their dreams, their fears. And in all of that, something more had grown. Something neither of them could name just yet. "You've changed, Lucas," Lyra said softly, breaking the silence. "You're different from the person I met when you first arrived. You've let me in, and I see it. I see you." Lucas looked at her, his chest tightening. He didn't know how to respond. He knew she was right. He had changed. But he still wasn't ready to admit the truth, not even to himself. The emotions he felt for her were powerful, but they scared him in ways he hadn't expected. The way she understood him. The way she made him feel safe. He had never experienced anything like it. "I don't know what I'm feeling, Lyra," Lucas admitted, his voice low. "But whatever it is, it's real. And I don't know how to handle it." Lyra smiled softly, a quiet warmth in her eyes. "You don't have to handle it alone, Lucas. I'm here, and I understand. You don't have to be afraid of what you're feeling." But even as she said the words, she knew that Lucas wasn't ready to fully embrace them. He was still fighting against the fear, the uncertainty, and the complexity of their situation. They came from different worlds, with different ways of understanding emotions and relationships. How could something so simple, so pure, survive in a world built on such differences? And yet, despite the barriers they faced, neither of them could deny the growing bond between them. As the days turned into weeks, their relationship continued to evolve, from a cautious connection to something more profound. Lucas no longer looked at Lyra just as a friend. He looked at her with a growing sense of longing, a desire that scared him, but also excited him in ways he couldn't explain. But the fear still lingered, a quiet undercurrent that kept him from fully giving in to what they both seemed to be feeling. For Lyra, the feeling was equally undeniable. She had always been a listener, someone who understood others' emotions before they even spoke them. But with Lucas, she felt a connection that went beyond just empathy. She felt his heart, his soul, and she knew, without a doubt, that their bond was real. Yet just like him, she hesitated. Was it too soon? Was it too complicated? But as the days stretched into months, the line between friendship and love began to blur. Neither of them could deny it any longer. What had started as a connection born out of necessity had blossomed into something much more. And though the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear. Lucas and Lyra were no longer just two people from different worlds trying to survive together. They were two hearts beginning to understand each other in a way they never thought possible. As the days passed, Lucas found himself standing at a crossroads. He had spent so much time battling with the fear of vulnerability, struggling to hide behind the walls he had carefully built over the years. But with each passing day in Aoria, those walls began to crumble, piece by piece. The bond he shared with Lyra had become something far more profound than either of them had anticipated. Their relationship had gone from tentative friendship to something deep and powerful, a love that transcended both their worlds. They had faced countless challenges together, learning to understand each other's emotions and cultures, adapting to a life that was far from what either of them had ever known. Lyra had always been a source of unwavering support for him. She had been patient, gentle, and understanding as he navigated this alien world. But it wasn't just about surviving Aoria. It was about thriving there, and for that, Lucas had to accept the most difficult thing of all, his own emotions. He had fought against them for so long, believing that to show vulnerability was a weakness, that allowing others to see his true feelings would expose him in a way he couldn't control. But with Lyra, he realized that letting go of that fear was the only way to move forward. One evening, as they sat together under the soft glow of the twin suns, Lucas turned to Lyra. "I never thought I could let go of all the things I kept hidden," he said, his voice quiet, but full of certainty. "But with you, I feel like I can finally breathe. I feel like I'm finally me." Lyra's eyes softened as she reached out to gently hold his hand. "You've always been you, Lucas," she replied. "But now you're free to live it, to live with all of your heart." For the first time, Lucas understood what true freedom felt like. Not the freedom to hide his emotions or his fears, but the freedom to embrace them. He had always thought that by shutting people out, he could protect himself. But in Lyra, he had found someone who made him feel safe enough to open up, to trust again. As they sat together, Lucas realized that he had finally found the place where he truly belonged. It wasn't just the new world around him. It was the love they had built, the trust and the understanding that went beyond words. And for the first time since arriving on Aoria, Lucas felt at peace with himself and with his place in the universe. This wasn't just about adapting to a new culture or overcoming the fear of vulnerability. It was about discovering that love, true love, could bridge every gap, cross every barrier, and lead them both to a future they never thought possible. Across the galaxies, across time itself. You've found your way here. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. Let's see how far across the universe our community reaches. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because tomorrow's episode will take you even deeper into the unknown. You won't want to miss it.